Hello and welcome to In Progress. Today we're talking about the 10 events that defined 2022 with me, your host, Raymond Perez. So we do this every year, or we have done this for the past 2 years, which is actually quite a long time. But basically what we have done is put together 10 events that defined the previous year. So I actually did this in January of this year for December 2021, but I'm doing it earlier. So Merry Christmas if it comes out that day, or maybe not. If it comes out afterwards, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, Shah Sameach for our Jewish friends out there. And maybe there's another, I don't know. Well, when is Eid? There's like Eids every couple days. So anyway, we're talking about the 10 events that defined 2022. So Happy New Year. That should be one for everyone, unless you follow the lunar calendar. Anyway, let's go right into number 10. Actually, let's not. Let's talk very briefly about my last year's number 10, which was actually Russia and Ukraine. So, okay, maybe putting it that low was a bad idea, but I actually stand by that still, because if it hadn't broken out into a war, then it wouldn't be, then it would still be number 10. It wouldn't be higher on the list. So just prefacing this, I am not a crystal ball. I have no real understanding of the world outside of what I believe. So let's just put that out there. I don't have any crystal ball. So maybe our number 10 is going to actually be the most massive story. Maybe there will be an artificial intelligence uprising, and people will be laughing that I have it at number 10. But for right now, I think it's good enough to say that this is number 10. Artificial intelligence. So my real point with putting this at number 10 is that I think artificial intelligence is beginning to enter the public consciousness as something that can actually change the culture. So this painting, well, it's not even a painting, right? It's just so difficult to even talk about these things, because this AI art was created by DALL-E 2, which is a neural network that basically functions to create art. It was made, or it was published at least in June or July 2022, and people have been having fun with it. There were other DALL-Es before that, but this is certainly the best one. Now, it creates AI art in some neural network way. I don't know computer science, so I can't really get into how it does that. Although neural networking learning actually is not a difficult topic to talk about. Basically, they just bombard these algorithms with various inputs, and then it will eventually create outputs from that. Maybe not a great description, but that's how it works at its very basics. So what is the impact on culture? I don't know. Does it actually challenge human creativity? Does it actually mimic human creativity? I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. It mimics human creativity. But is it really creative? Can it be creative? Is that something that it can be? Those are questions that we are going to have to grapple with as society, and not just in the abstract philosophical way, but in the literal legal sense, right? Who owns AI art? That will certainly be a question, especially because these AI algorithms are trained on copyrighted images, right? So what this really means, we don't know. And not only that, but this is not just an art problem, right? Eventually, people are talking about this being a problem with more white collar jobs, like lawyers, like even doctors. So the question is, what role will AI play in these types of fields, the creative fields? And it seems like people are very angry about its impact on art. So with that happy note, let's go on into an even happier note, which is our 9th topic. So it brings me no joy. I'm so sad that Sam Bankman-Fried is getting locked up. But anyway, our 9th topic is the crypto collapse. So I've been predicting this for a while, and maybe I've been proven right. But basically, I've always thought crypto was kind of a silly grift, especially these types of crypto banks like FTX and these other ones. So there have been 2 different crypto collapses. basically you saw the collapse of like these so-called stable coins, like Luna's, like Luna Tether, like these certain types of coins. And then you also saw the collapse of these crypto exchanges like FTX. So basically, the reason why I saw these things as collapsing is because when you promise a risk-free return that is higher than, the general risk-free rate, which should be less than 3% in literally every case, when you're promising things like 9% risk-free return, I mean, that's just not possible, right? It's just not something that can happen. So given that, to me, it was very obvious that these things were scams. Now, maybe some of them aren't scams. I'm still going to hold out that maybe not all of them are scams, but all of them are not sustainable. So crypto now seems to actually be on its back foot. It seems to be finally on retreat. And a lot of the people who were in my DMs and in my comments saying Doge to $1 have been completely trolled and probably lost a lot of money in these scams. Now, that doesn't give me any joy, doesn't bring me any happiness. I am not someone who partakes in Schadenfreude, to use a term from the Germans. And actually, it's an English term, so I don't even know why I use a German accent. Hopefully, I do not get canceled. But the point I'm making here is that crypto is on its back foot, and that seems to be a very major story with staying power into the next year. But Sam Bankman-Fried is not going to be a free man at the end of this year, or definitely not at the end of next year. So even though he's out on bail right now, I think that this is going to be a major story into the next year. So let's go into the 8th, which is trouble in Britain. Some people would say trouble in paradise, but Britain is certainly not paradise, not even to the people who live there. So first, the obvious story, which was huge, Queen Elizabeth II died. And people may be very angry that I call this a political story, but it absolutely is. Queen Elizabeth was the figurehead for multiple countries, not just Britain, but also Canada, Australia, etc. And they were all connected to the Queen and to royalty in some sense. I mean, the Queen has played a role in politics, maybe not directly, but through the Governor General, especially in countries like Australia. So it's really important that she died. It really, not just as a cultural milestone, but also as a political milestone, because I think you're going to begin to see a lot of nations who are connected to Britain via the monarchy begin to look to abolish the monarchy in some sense over the coming years. So that's true with Queen Elizabeth, but that's actually not the point of this slide. The point of this slide and the point of this event more generally is to talk about how finance is beginning to treat Britain like a middle power, because that's what it is. Now, this middle power of Britain has generally been a financial great power. In the past, the pound sterling held similar levels of respect as the US dollar. And it even still held that up to 2020. So, of course, the pound sterling was never the dollar, or at least hasn't been the dollar for years. But it has at least been a reserve currency, right? The dollar, the euro, and the British pound. But the British pound lost a lot of its value over the past month, or it's December now, but since September, it lost a lot of its value. And the major reason why is because of the management of the economy. So Britain has been pretty terrible at its economy recently. Let's first begin with what destroyed the entire British political system, which was Boris Johnson, who came in, well, first actually Brexit, right? Britain leaving the EU, that's very important, but we already know that. So Boris Johnson comes in and basically wins a massive majority in 2019. And then over the last year, he basically just like lost so much political capital by the amount of scandals he was embroiled in, and also the fact that the economic climate was becoming worse and worse. So he had to leave in, I believe, June or July of this year. So he basically got kicked out by his own members of parliament. And there was a leadership election, and Liz Truss won that leadership election against Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt. So Rishi Sunak was the moderate in that race. Liz Truss was this hardline Thatcherite, and she comes to power appoints Kwasi Kwarteng Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is our Secretary of the Treasury. And basically, Kwarteng and Truss passed what is called the mini budget, or I think it was called the growth plan. And that mini budget was so fiscally irresponsible because it cut taxes and increased spending during a time that, like, economists thought that we should have austerity in Britain. And austerity is kind of silly in itself, but, who cares? It's Britain. Now, that had itself hurt the British pound, or not just the British pound, but also the 30-year gilts that England issues. That yields had actually hit around 5%, or actually over 5%. And remember that price and yield are inverse variables in the bond market. So the prices fell, the yields rose. And that was huge because that meant the British economy, or that meant that global finance viewed British pound, the British pound, as much less and much more worthless than it had been in like August. So that's pretty bad. Right. And Truss has to resign as a result. She fires Kwarteng, but that's not enough. She brings in Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's not enough. So she's eventually forced to resign. And Rishi Sunak, the moderate, and I use moderate in quotes, I actually have a piece going out on this in the Foreign Affairs Review, that basically Sunak is now in charge, and who knows what that means for Britain. He has kind of been missing in action recently, so no one really knows what he's doing. But, maybe things are going to go better. Although the truth is you're going to see massive strikes. The railway strikes, for instance, in Britain. So, honestly, no one really knows what's going to happen. But it certainly won't be smooth sailing for Sunak. And that's huge for Britain, which has been a financial stronghold in the past. Okay. So let's look at number 7, which is civil unrest. And basically, there were massive protests throughout the autocracies of the world. I don't really want to go too deep into this, but Russia had anti-war protests against the mobilization and against the initial war in February. So those led to thousands of arrests. Iran is, of course, having the anti-hijab protests and the and Masa Amini protests. Those are also taking place in Iran. And, there are apparently going to be a lot of executions in Iran, although that story itself was a bit questionable. And, there are so many different things happening in Iran that I can't get into it in just 1 minute. And I just realized that this is not going to be 1 minute per. But anyway, we're already at like 10 minutes. The point is, more protests in China, especially with the white paper protests that happened against the COVID restrictions, the massive draconian restrictions in China. And there were also protests in Sri Lanka, which primarily dealt with the fuel crisis in Sri Lanka that basically made it so that no one could afford anything. It was actually shocking because even like the middle class in Sri Lanka was completely decimated. So they marched in the president's palace and basically overthrew the government. Okay, so the 6th is the pink tide. The pink tide, I have an entire video about this, but just to run through it very quickly, the pink tide was something that happened in the early 2000s where left-wing governments began being elected in multiple countries in South America. Of course, Bolivia, you have Evo Morales. Venezuela, Hugo Chavez comes to power. Brazil, Lula comes to power. All these different left-wing governments come to power. And then eventually you see a backlash to that called the blue wave. Not the blue wave that happened, of course, in November, but the blue wave of the 2010s. And various center-right governments come to power. Now you're seeing a second pink tide. So that began in around 2018 with AMLO's election in Mexico, but now it's beginning to move back to South America with the elections of Pedro Castillo, which happened last year, the election of Gabriel Boric in Chile, which happened last year, and the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia this year, and Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil. So all these different left leaders are being buoyed by concerns about climate change and just general progressivism, especially in Chile. So these different things, and also failure of right-wing governments, to be clear, like the failure of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the failure of Macri, for instance, in Argentina, or at least what was viewed as his failure, even though Macri tends to be viewed more favorably by modern thought. Anyway, the point is that you're seeing a massive move to the left in Latin America, and that is huge because the Amazon rainforest, for instance, needs to be protected, and the only people who can do that are the left wing in Latin America. Now, honestly, Lula may not get much done because he has a massively right wing legislature, but who knows? And also, the pink tide seems to even be receding now. Pedro Castillo, the left wing president of Peru, just tried to do a coup d'état and then got destroyed. So, yeah, I mean, the pink tide is not over, but could be very soon. So now let's talk about the decoupling of the West and China. Basically, the United States, the European Union, and Australia are now seeking to decouple themselves from China, especially as Xi Jinping centralizes his power in the country. So just briefly moving through this, the U.S. passed the CHIPS Act and is beginning to move against like Chinese companies like TikTok. Of course, that was Huawei earlier, but now they're beginning to move against other Chinese companies. And with the CHIPS Act, they're also moving against people who manufacture semiconductors in China. So people in China who manufacture semiconductors have to choose between their American citizenship and continuing to do the industry in China. And most people are beginning to leave China for that reason. So also a lot of American companies, by the way, are leaving China for better markets like Indonesia and India, for instance. So that's number one. Number two, you have the EU, who is beginning to do the Global Gateway Project for infrastructure, and it's supposed to challenge China's Belt and Road Initiative, although it's a little questionable whether it will. Australia is beginning to move much more closer to the United States, and a major reason why that is happening is because of the shift in government from the conservatives. Wow, from the liberals, who are conservative, by the way, to Labor under Anthony Albanese. So, and to be clear, that's not the reason why that's happening. The Morrison government was not particularly pro-China, but both parties are beginning to move against China. And then finally, Japan, which is not mentioned here, is beginning to look towards Southeast Asian markets. I don't know too much about what's happening with Japan and Southeast Asia because Japan is not an economy that is super that is super interesting to me. But it should be noted that Japan is moving towards Southeast Asia, which I noted, I believe, last year that was beginning to happen. And that's very important because Japan is one of China's largest trading partners, as well as vice versa. Also, South Korea is doing something with China. I think it's moving as well to oppose China, but that's questionable, and who really knows what's going to happen? Because when push comes to shove in East Asia, a lot of these countries will choose China, and honestly, that's to be expected, right? And let's be clear, I didn't even mention this, but there is a new economic partnership, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that's between China and multiple countries in Southeast Asia. So China is also, like let's be clear, China is not losing this battle, but it seems to be on its back foot right now. And I think that's going to continue into the next year. Okay. Number 4 is one I'm not super proud of, because I don't like recency bias, but to me, this is very interesting. Fusion ignition was achieved just recently, actually, December 5th, 2022. So basically, scientists at the National Ignition Facility, they were the first to do this fusion ignition. And basically, fusion ignition is, so first, let's take a step back. Nuclear energy is very complicated. There are 2 types of nuclear reactions: nuclear fission, which is what nuclear power plants today use, and they use these very radioactive elements like uranium, and I believe some use plutonium. I don't know though. and nuclear fusion, which is what the sun does, right? The sun fuses hydrogen into helium, and that creates a lot of energy. So what fusion scientists have been trying to do is fuse hydrogen atoms together to create not just energy, but more energy than it takes to fuse those atoms together. And it was recently done at the lab in, I believe, California. And this lab did a fusion ignition, and that could be a major milestone for the development of nuclear fusion. Now, the reason why I was questionable about putting this in is because I don't know whether this will be a massive story next year, because apparently this is going to take a very long time, if not a decade, to actually become a very relevant thing. But it's something to mark out, right? Like when the computer was invented, it probably would be a big story, but no one would recognize it at the time. I think. I don't really know about how the computer was invented, but I assume that would be the case. And yeah, so the fusion ignition to me seems like it's going to be very relevant into the next year. Which one is certainly going to be relevant? We're reaching number 3, so of course it should be. And that is interest rate hikes. Yeah, that definitely defined last year. I mean, people have been going crazy about inflation. And for kind of good reason. Again, I mentioned, and I will continue to mention this, that I don't think inflation will be a major issue or has been a major issue. I mean, 8% inflation is high, but it's not like the highest thing in the world. It's much worse when it's paired with stagnation, which it wasn't. So interest rate is increasing because the Federal Reserve, and not just Federal Reserve, but also the European Central Bank, has begun to raise interest rates in order to stem the rise in inflation. And that hurts a lot of people. That hurts especially the impoverished in developing countries, because the Federal Reserve is the risk-free rate, and those countries deal with so much risk. So that increases the risk premium on their interest rates. It's going to be massive for them, and has already been massive for them. You can even see the same thing with developing countries like Sri Lanka, for instance, who couldn't service their debts because of the high interest rates. So that's going to be number one. But for us in the West, it's going to be massive as well, because you're going to see mortgage rates increase as a result, and various other rates, credit card rates, like a bunch of these different rates will increase as a result of the interest rate increases from the Federal Reserve. And finally, let's see. What is the other thing that I wanted to mention? Well, I don't remember. I think that was it. But yeah, that's right. Tech stocks are beginning to completely collapse, because the major reason why tech stocks were so heavily inflated is because of the availability of free money. So you saw Tesla collapse from 1,200 at the beginning of the year, 1,200 billion, 1.2 trillion to use an actual number, as its market capitalization at the beginning of the year. Now it's at 400 billion market cap. And honestly, Tesla has always been overvalued just because people love Elon Musk for some reason. But yeah, I mean, I saw it coming. Maybe I was the only one, but I wasn't, because, Warren Buffett, I think, also saw it coming. And yeah, I mean, these companies are beginning to lose market value because of that. Because of the interest rate hikes that have basically made money much less available for them. Finally, not finally, number 2 is our new normal. The pandemic is basically over. People are acting like the pandemic is completely ended. And I'm going to basically say that this happened after Omicron. I think that basically people realized after Omicron that the vaccine, it worked, but it didn't work as well as we expected against these new variants. So yeah, the pandemic is over. At least the government thinks the pandemic is over and has no real political capital to use in making people care about the pandemic. I mean, it sucks. The pandemic is not over in the sense of people getting sick, because people are still getting sick and people are still getting very sick and dying. But I think we are definitely past the worst. Something major, though, is that China recently has 250 million people infected by the virus. That's like 250 million people infected in the past literally 60 days. So that is massive for countries outside of the West, especially countries like China that tried to keep the virus at bay with zero COVID policies. But even China has abandoned that zero COVID policy. So it's very unlikely that the COVID pandemic continues in a political sense. Also, if we look at like the midterms in the United States, right? people barely cared about the pandemic. I don't know if that was even a factor in anyone's vote, other than people who were just very angry at these pandemic restrictions. Anyway, so that's number 2. And finally, no honorable mentions this time, but number 1 is obviously Russia and Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine, and yeah, all hell broke loose. There's not really much more to say on that. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people died. Millions fled Ukraine to Europe, creating a refugee crisis. The food supply issues, because Ukraine is the breadbasket of not just Europe, but even possibly the world. Russia and Ukraine both produce so much wheat that it's insane that that food prices have not completely gone crazy and basically collapsed parts of the west of the developing world. So that is very interesting. Then you have the energy supply issue, where Europe has been very reliant on Russian gas, and now that's not possible anymore because Russia is turning off the gas in certain circumstances. So, the Russia-Ukraine war can't really be overstated. I mean, it was the story this year, and it just percolated throughout every single story, not just in Europe, but in the United States, even in the developing world. I mean, it's really difficult to overstate the difficulties that Russia and Ukraine caused over the past year due to Putin's illegal invasion and also just stupid invasion of Ukraine. One final note on Russia and Ukraine. A lot of times people viewed the major conflict in the world as between the U.S. and Russia, but it's basically been shown that Russia has zero capability of standing up to the United States in any real way, because it has zero capability of standing up to many countries like NATO, when I say many countries, I don't mean like individually. Of course, Russia could theoretically invade, like, I guess, Poland and win, but not the countries combined, like NATO. So that just shows that Russia is not on the side of the U.S., or not on the caliber of the U.S. And, that's almost laughable because I've heard from so many Russian nationalists on YouTube comment sections about how great Russia is, but it turns out that Russia sucks. But, I always knew that. Anyway, with that is the 10 stories of 2022 that need to be discussed and thought about very strongly from the standpoint of thinking. Okay, so thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, etc. Get very upset in the comment section that I didn't mention, I don't know, NFTs. I guess I did. I haven't mentioned NFTs. Just get very upset in the comment section. And yeah, like, subscribe, share is another good thing. And I will see you next year, or maybe before that if I can record another video. So thank you for watching.